Season 4, Episode 2, Learner Profile 7 with Noah Oskow. If you have an interesting language learning story, maybe you learned a lot of languages, or you learned them in an interesting way, or you spent time abroad, or maybe you have some kind of interesting story to tell, don't hesitate to apply to be a guest on the show at actualfluency.com/guest. You'll see a little form, and hopefully I can hear your story as well in an upcoming Learner Profiles episode. What else? Well, that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this talk with Noah. In the talk, we talk about his experience learning Hebrew and Japanese, especially, and how that kind of an obsession in a language can lead to a lifelong interest in languages. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you enjoy the podcast, please do consider supporting it on Patreon. You can choose whatever amount you feel comfortable supporting it with. And that's actualfluency.com/support. It's going to take you straight to that page. And, join the 10 other people or listeners. And shout out to my patrons out there. Thanks so much for supporting. And I hope to see you. I also put up some extra stuff there. So enjoy the episode, and I'll see you later. I'm so happy to be back with another episode of the Actual Fluency Podcast. And on the show today, I've got Noah. And Noah, why don't you start by telling the listeners who you are, where you're from, and how you got into languages?
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Noah Oskow. I'm from Minnesota in the United States, as I think most people probably know. Basically, I'm really into languages now, and I currently live in Japan. I've been speaking Japanese for something like 12 years. I was a translator I still kind of am a translator. I have been for about 4 or 5 years as well, and currently I'm a teacher on the JET program in Japan. I teach English to elementary students in rural Japan. And basically my story with language, I guess, would be that I went to a Jewish elementary school, and we learned Hebrew. Actually, I started probably learning Hebrew to some extent back in preschool. So basically, as long as I've been alive, there's been like some other, other than English, there's been like some sort of like foreign language sort of thing going on in my life. And especially like, other alphabets, since Hebrew uses its own unique alphabet as well. So like from elementary all the way up until 8th grade, I also went to a Jewish middle school, and Hebrew was just a regular part of our everyday education. And at the time, I wasn't super into it. I think this is a thing that a lot of polyglots actually have in common, right? Is like, when we go to school, I don't know if we're like super into the languages that we're kind of made to learn, when it's not like your own choice, And like, I think for Jews, it's like a big part of our culture. Hebrew is a big part of our culture. But when you're a kid and when you're in like a different society, I think this is something that happens to like, for example, people in Ireland learning Irish too, right? Mm-hmm. When you don't feel that use of the language, and you don't feel like you need to have that passion for something like that, you aren't necessarily super into it. And I was actually quite bad at Hebrew when I was in primary and middle school. I was probably one of the worst in both my elementary and middle school out of all my all of my fellow students. And and I did pretty badly. But around like fifth or sixth grade, I got pretty interested in Japanese culture and media and stuff, which is a pretty common story for people who start learning Japanese. And I kind of started studying it by myself. I think the idea that, even though I wasn't good at Hebrew, and even though I wasn't a good student when it came to Hebrew, the idea that you could learn another language, and also the fact that another alphabet wasn't really scary to me, as I was getting interested in Japanese media, I really wanted to learn Japanese as a language to be able to kind of, watch movies or like read comic books or something that hadn't been translated yet or something like that. So I kind of just started studying by myself off of some textbooks that I got at the library. And, I didn't make it super duper far because I was just studying by myself. Fifth, sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade, while I was also still learning Hebrew at school, which of course probably just made my Hebrew studies even worse, honestly. But I was into it, so I did like get a little bit of a base, I kept being interested in it, and I was lucky enough when I went to high school to actually go to a school, to Armstrong High School in Plymouth, Minnesota, that actually had Japanese classes, which is at the time was still really rare. It's not quite as rare nowadays, I think, but it was one of only a few high schools in all of Minnesota that offered Japanese as an option, right? Because in America, I think even to today, I know nowadays Chinese is being added to a lot of, Mandarin's being added to a lot of schools. But back then, basically every single school, the options were Spanish, which was the main one, and then French and German and maybe Latin. But Japanese was very rare, and I was lucky enough that the school that was basically, I could walk there across a forest from my house. They had Japanese, and not only did they have Japanese, but the teacher, our teacher, Mike Smart, was just an incredible teacher who really knew how to inspire kids. And he actually ended up becoming the Minnesota Teacher of the Year, I think maybe back in 2007.
Wow.
You got to meet President Bush. It's a great honor. But he was just an amazing teacher that really inspired all of the students, including me. And thanks to his tutelage and my kind of like passion for the language, I just kind of really kept on getting better. I got to go on exchange to Japan in high school for 3 months in the summer. I lived with like a host family in somewhat rural Japan in Ehime Prefecture. I got to go to school. I got to go to Japanese high school and kind of, have like an almost kind of normal high school life here in Japan for a few months, which was a really cool experience. And it happened to be the prefecture in Japan that had the smallest proportion of Americans within the population of the entire country.
Wow.
It was something like there was like 3 Americans for every 100,000 people, right? So I was here in Japan for 3 months. It was only probably the third country I'd ever been to in my life outside of America. For the 3 months, the only people who could speak English with me, there was like 1 or 2 teachers at school who could do it okay. And beyond that, I didn't encounter anyone who was not Japanese for a very long time, and I had to use Japanese for everything, like every single day. And my host father was an English teacher at one of these cram schools that kids go to after school to study more for tests. And he had the most amazing English vocabulary, and he would just ask me, like breakfast, he'd just be like Noah, what does this word mean? And it would be like the most complex word you can think of, and he'd be able to like figure it out and memorize it, but he could not form a sentence.
Wow.
for his life, basically. Even though he had like learned, like he knew the grammar and he knew so many words. I'm sure he knows in the words of Donald Trump, he knows the best words, but
Right. Yeah, I know words.
I know words. I know the best words. But he could we couldn't really have a conversation in English. So like I use Japanese every single day. Just listen to it constantly. All the television was Japanese. The only escape I had from Japanese at all was just, reading some like books I had brought with, Game of Thrones, actually, which is now quite popular, but it wasn't then.
Right.
That was my only escape. But other than that, it was just 100% Japanese all the time. And it was actually, it was pretty incredible. And it really helped me increase my fluency a lot. I just had a great experience, and when I left, I really knew I wanted to get back and I wanted to keep on, bettering my language and everything. So I graduated high school. I went to college in Kansas. I majored in East Asian languages and cultures and Japanese, and kind of sort of double majored in international politics. And and then once I was at college, I think at first my Japanese went down a bit. You get really involved with social stuff, but I knew I wanted to go on exchange, and I finally was able to go on exchange my junior year, and I went to Tokyo for 2 years, and I just had like the most incredible time. I had such an incredible time that I made the semi-questionable decision of staying a second year on exchange, which I think is a really rare thing.
Yeah.
So I actually had 2 full years in Tokyo, and just made a huge amount of Japanese friends and got incredibly involved in like the society. And I was hanging out with a lot of people from a lot of different countries who spoke a lot of different languages. So maybe my Japanese didn't improve as much as it should have in that time period, but I really not only was I able to kind of like immerse myself more in the culture, but I was also able to make so many friends from all these different countries and started to kind of get more and more involved in different cultures as well. And I kind of, I really got into my mind that I wanted to learn more languages, and I started studying other ones, and I kind of started maybe to go a little bit back to Hebrew as well. And once I finished that entire experience, when I was finally back in America, I was able to actually start making money working as a translator online, which has really kind of, allowed me to, have a lot of, really enjoy living in a lot of different places and having time to study. And I finally ended up getting onto the JEP program, which is this English teaching program in Japan that I think, it's really, really well known within the community of people who study Japanese within the United States and other countries as well. And so now I ended up here. I teach English. I've been doing this for 2 years. And every day I have just enough time to, take a few hours and study another language. And now I've, managed to finally go back and actually correct a lot of the mistakes of my youth and not really focus on Hebrew, right? And Hebrew is now definitely my second best foreign language. And I also have gotten into quite, I think in the end I have about 10 languages that I at least kind of like dabble in occasionally. And I'd say maybe like 5 of those I'm pretty serious and hopefully continuing to get better. And all the while also hopefully, communicating some of what I've learned over the years in terms of language learning to the children that I teach as well. So that's basically my story.
Fantastic. It's a really wonderful story, and I love how you started with one passion, one language that was your passion, and then you sort of said, well, this was a nice experience, I should try to do this with some more languages. So and you're so right about being a child, and when you start learning foreign languages, sometimes the idea that you're sort of being prescribed a language can definitely cause a lot of resistance. And I remember my German classes back when I was really young. For some reason, I really enjoyed English classes. I think it's because we were all playing, Game Boy and we played, Football Manager 98 or something. And,
nice.
Yeah, it's a really nice game. Tried to play it recently. For some reason, it's terrible now. I guess anecdotally, it was a great game, but now it's terrible. But anyway, we were also used to using English in games, and we had to guess what everything meant. And there were no Danish translations or dubbings or anything. So when I started English at a very young age, I was kind of excited about it because I knew I could use it for the games and.
It had a real use for you, right?
Right. But when I started German,
you felt that reason.
When I started German, it was very different. I still enjoyed German because I did enjoy the languages back then, and I still do today. But there's still this element of it's not really your desire. It's like if your parents tell you to do something, you're very likely not to do it.
Yeah.
So
it really gives you the kind of the reverse.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit sad at how that psychology is, but I can definitely I feel you, and I'm just happy that I wasn't the worst, because I've seen a lot of students in those classes basically just zone out for every single German lesson ever. And if you ask them what does Auto mean, they're like, don't no idea. So you can get a lot worse than that. But I definitely see what you mean with the basically being told, and we don't like being told. I guess
Yeah, well, I see it. I see it every day, in my students. I mean, it depends on the class, but even the best class, there's a few kids who clearly they don't have any reason that they personally want to learn English. They don't see they don't see a future where they're going to use it. They certainly don't have a reason to use it in this exact moment, unless they want to talk to me. But I think they all know that I can speak Japanese. So
yeah, that's tough. Also, if you're being in a way, you're also being asked to choose a very important life choice. And I guess that a similar story is, I know in Denmark, and I'm sure it's the same all over the world, that if you're at the upper end of primary school, elementary school, then you're often being asked to choose your foreign language. We had a choice between French and Spanish, I think it was. And I know some schools have dabbled in more advanced languages like Russian and Chinese, but basically being asked as a, I don't know, 14-year-old, what do you want to study that will be basically useful for the rest of your life? It's a big decision, and I don't think enough awareness or information is being spread about just how important languages are. And it would be awesome if we had more teachers like you're Professor Smart or Mr. Smart. What do you call teachers?
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
Mr. Smart,
Mr. Smart. It would be nice if we had more people like that who can inspire the students without prescribing the language to them, because I think that's probably the biggest problem, is that it's very boring, and so students are not interested naturally, and then the teachers get really bored, because if the students are not engaged in your work, then you kind of take it personally, and that can be tough. I guess you have first-hand experience with that. I mean, it must be tough sometimes as a teacher if a lot of students don't really care about the material.
Yeah, I think that as a teacher, when you're in that sort of situation where, as you said, like it's really prescribed that they have to learn this, you see, firstly, you just do your best to try to engage and show them a reason why it's worthwhile. Also, just make it fun no matter what. So even if they still don't feel like it's worth it to learn the language in of itself, at least they have fun in class and they have fun using the language. That's incredibly important, right? And you also, you just look out for those kids. You can tell that they're even the worst class, even the class with even like a class that is way overcrowded or, has so many kids who are so obviously disinterested. There's always going to be some kids that are engaged and do want to learn, and you can tell that they want to learn. And kind of like, if you find those kids and you kind of make sure that the class is worthwhile for them while still trying to make it engaging for everyone else too, I think it kind of saves you from that feeling that what you're doing is like maybe not purposeless, but that the people that you're teaching aren't really happy that you're teaching it to them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm just worried that that's what happens, because then the teachers get very content, and then they don't try to make it interesting because they don't feel like anyone's paying any attention anyway, and then you have this very vicious cycle and teachers, I don't know why teachers are always old. Most of my teachers were certainly old. I don't know how that works biologically, but if they do that for a long time, they get set in their ways, so they don't use new pedagogy research, or they don't use new methods or anything. And then the next poor batch of kids who come in and are like, oh, I want to learn German. Then the teacher's like, yes, today we're going to conjugate all the verbs twice. And it's like, ugh, take
so
me
useful.
Away. But
yeah, it's painful. But I mean, at least I get to be mildly youthful still, I suppose. But it's like you were saying as well, in America, in America, I think one of the issues, in America, you do have a few choices once you get into, I'm not, honest, because I didn't go to public middle school, so I'm not 100% sure how it works in middle school in America, but at least in high school, once you're there, you get to choose between a few languages. But I think that there is a real issue where there's not enough effort to kind of really communicate the value of certain languages, or what, the worth of studying something, or even just language in general. I feel like, in America, as in a lot of countries, like speaking another language is definitely a prestige thing, but I don't think there's a lot of education going on about why that's a valuable thing, or like why it would be worthwhile, just maybe awareness beyond even just a business stance, like what the cultural value might be, or just, the personal value might be. And I think communicating that could really be helpful in getting kids more involved from the get-go when they're studying.
Well, you could turn the entire country around, I think, because it would give a much more open approach to integrating the different societies. For instance, I recently had Richard Benton on, and he talked about how he was learning Somali because there's a big Somali group, and he also lives in Minnesota, by the way.
Yeah. I
Lived in
actually heard that
Minnesota.
episode. Yeah.
And you know, can you imagine going down to any American city and just saying to Americans, well, if you learn Somali, you can have a much better day with your fellow citizens, and they're gonna completely go like, what are you talking about? But if you start early with that approach and say in the end of elementary school, try to bring the value in, almost like when undergrads are looking for new universities, the universities send out representatives to kind of sell the university. Maybe they should be like people selling the value of foreign language learning. And because if I lived in America and obviously only talking about what I've heard here, but from what I understand, there are large communities in different parts of the country where many people speak maybe Spanish, Chinese even.
Absolutely.
So if I lived in the vicinity of such a community, I would say that would, if I learned Chinese and there was a huge Chinese population, that would definitely be bringing the community closer together if everyone started doing that, and there would be less of a us and them feeling and more of an us feeling in general. But yeah, maybe this is a little bit too ambitious, but it would be nice.
It's definitely nice to contemplate, right? I mean, I wish that Minnesotan schools would. I don't know, maybe some of them do, but I mean, I don't know about them. But like teaching Somali. We also have a huge Hmong population as well. That'd be another great language to teach in the schools.
Right.
And also probably for, even for the second generation people in those communities, it'd probably be great for them to be able to have that opportunity.
It can be a little sad when they just hear it a little bit at home and they don't really speak it. They understand it a little bit, and by the next generation, it's completely gone. And
I know that's a major source of regret from a lot of second generation things when they or people, excuse me, not meaning to call anyone things, but like second generation people, especially if you can understand your parents but you can't really speak back to them, it can be like a big issue with the family itself. And it's I think as the years go on, you get older and you kind of lose that connection to your culture. It can be a big fun. I mean, even I had something similar, and my family, we came to America in like the 1890s from what is now Belarus. So and so like Hebrew, Hebrew is not like the language of our direct ancestors or our family. Yiddish was, as well as Russian. But even so, like being part of the community as I got, after high school and once I was in college and once I felt like my Japanese was getting good enough, I really did start to have even that sort of like kind of regret of not having that connection with my roots, being able to speak Hebrew. And to some extent, I wish I could speak Yiddish too, even though, I didn't really grow up around anyone speaking that.
Right.
But if I can have that sort of regret about not speaking good enough Hebrew or Yiddish or something when I'm not even directly connected with family members who really still speak those languages, I can only imagine what it would be like as a direct second generation person.
And it's happening all the time because it's being suppressed as well. Because there's no, everyone's saying, "Oh, you should learn English," and then then they do, and then the next generation only learns English, and it's all gone, and it's kind of sad in a way. But hopefully, this awareness that we're all trying to spread a little bit will help to make that happen. I have seen some progress in the second generation or maybe even third generation kind of area. I saw some people talking about looking for basically materials to teach I think it was a second or third generation to a German immigrant who didn't teach their kids German when they were growing up and now sort of regretted it. So now they wanted some materials specifically designed for children of immigrants to learn that language again. And so that's kind of positive. I guess that there's still hope, but it's definitely a big force you're fighting against, because if you don't speak English, you'll definitely feel some kind of exclusion and
I mean, in America, it'd be a huge issue at least in a lot of communities. There are communities where there are definitely communities in certain areas where you can get around without English, but at least where I came from, I think that, if you weren't able to use it properly, and I think there is a lot of pressure from parents even, to maybe sometimes to not speak the
Yep.
original language and to only speak English, to really want their kids to really, to have that and not to have their like, home language, which is, I understand why they want it sometimes, but it can definitely be detrimental to that connection with the past and connection with your family. So
Yeah, and they think they might be thinking, oh, you need English to get a good career, but actually, I would argue the opposite is probably more true, because
yeah,
it's really rare to find people who are bilingual, truly bilingual in something with English. It's kind of hard. So if you live in America or if you live in England, then the kids, and you put the kids in an English school, of course, then they're almost certainly going to learn English. I mean,
yeah. I mean, they're in that
almost,
environment.
there's almost no way they don't learn English. So if you speak German to them at home, you're basically blessing them with bilingualism, which
Yeah.
is a pretty big gift. And then if you look at career opportunities, suddenly you can work with a lot of things when you have two perfect languages. Whereas if you only learn English, well, you're fighting with, I don't know,
Everyone else who's
200
only
million
was
people.
monolingual within
Right.
within whatever country you live in within that language. So that's definitely true. And I know when I was a kid, like at the school I went to, we had some of my fellow students were like their parents were immigrants from Russia. That was actually quite common, and I was always so jealous that they automatically got two languages, and I couldn't even speak Hebrew well at all. And then as I put so much effort into Japanese for so many years, it's like, I wish if only my family had been bilingual, that would have
Yeah.
been so helpful. But
Yeah, regrets, I mean, my family only had Danish, so there you go. I had to do it myself. And I see some people have. There was particularly one girl in my high school class that I was so jealous about, because
yeah.
she had grown up with, first of all, it was a mixed family, so I think they had two languages at home to begin with. And then when she was between 0 and 5 years old, they moved to sort of 5 different countries and lived there for a year.
Really?
So when she came to school, she spoke like 7 languages, and 6 of them like native speaker, and it was like, what? And I was just so jealous. But some people get
It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, some people win the language lottery, and some people have to grind through the
just claw our way up.
grab a verb here and there. That's what we can do. But I wanted to talk to you about your Japanese learning experience, because I know that it's kind of a different one too if you had stayed in America all the time and just read books and done the usual. But were there any challenging aspects to learning Japanese, the sort of very natural way you did it? And if so, how did you overcome those?
What I have to say, I think that Japanese, I know that for example, the U.S. government ranks Japanese as basically the most difficult language for a native English speaker to learn in the entire world, apparently, which I think is definitely a bit of an exaggeration, personally. Admittedly, it is an incredibly different language from English, and if you're not used to encountering other languages like that, I think it can be, very. It can be very frightening, when you first started out. But honestly, what I think probably really helped me out from the very beginning of when I was studying Japanese, even when I was in elementary school and just doing it by myself, was honestly the amount of Japanese media that I was kind of watching or reading or whatever, And I think this is something that probably, I think a lot of people who get into this language, it comes from being really into kind of the anime culture. If I don't know if you know about it at all or anything, but into Japanese animation or into Japanese movies. I know that people who are getting into Korean, it's coming from a similar source as well, with the Korean wave and Korean pop music and stuff. But Japanese, there's just such a huge amount of media that you can, because it really, Japan is basically, along with America and India, it's one of the 3 countries that produces the most of its own media of anywhere in the world. And so there's just so much television, and there's so many movies, and especially I would say there's actually a lot of really high quality, especially like animation shows, and also movies, maybe not recent movies as much, but there's still just a huge tradition of really high quality Japanese films, animated or live action. And having that resource and being into that, you just hear so much of the language. At least if you choose to watch it with the subtitles, right? Yeah, obviously, if you're watching it dub, it's not going to help you with your language very much. But if that's what you enjoy, that's what you enjoy. And I think that from like when I was first getting into this, I was already watching like a lot of these shows or movies, and I was hearing so much Japanese, and I was reading these subtitles, and starting to make those connections and hearing the way it was spoken and hearing the kind of the natural way that, the natural rhythm and like the exact like kind of phrases that were used time and time again. And I took note of those things, and that kind of really gave me like this boost when I first got into school and into high school into Japanese, where I already kind of had like something. I can't really call it immersion, right? But I can call it like a lot of experience having heard it and also having had the subtitles go with it, where I could kind of try to figure it out. And it gave me, I think, a much more natural base in the language than I would have had otherwise. And then obviously, the incredible amount of immersion that I've gotten over the years is incredibly helpful. And, I didn't actually mention it, but when I was in university, once I got back from Japan, I was the event chair for the Japanese Student Association, so I was like really involved with like all of the Japanese exchange students and all of these big events we had together. So I was speaking Japanese. I might have been speaking more Japanese per day in the middle of Kansas than I was and some days. I'm like 100% serious too, which is a little bit ridiculous. But like I'd be in Tokyo and like in this dormitory, and we'd have like it would be like it was like 60. It was a boys only dormitory. Punishment of being kicked out of the dormitory if you even brought a girl through the door or something. But there was like 45. It was like 45 Japanese students and about 15 exchange students, or give or take, depending on the semester, from all over the world. And of course, you can get really involved with, if someone can speak the same language as you, even if you're trying to learn the other languages, sometimes you can get caught in what I think even in episodes that you've had previously, people have talked about that kind of expat bubble. You can get caught,
for sure, yeah.
which is true even for exchange students if you have that opportunity, and so sometimes in Japan I might be hanging out with these people more during the day than with Japanese people. But once I got back to college, or once I got back to the United States, I was kind of every single day just like with all of these exchange students and kind of working with them and planning things with them and doing stuff with them. So I was just speaking it so much every day in that situation. Now that I that I'm studying more and more languages, I really miss college, because what an amazing opportunity to meet people from different, right? It really is.
Yeah.
And I kind of capitalized on that a little bit as well when I was in college, because I helped found actually the Polyglot Club at the University of Kansas. Before, actually, I didn't even know what that word meant at that time. There is this Taiwanese guy named Terry. He's really like a pretty crazy hyper polyglot. He was recently on a TED Talk it was a Taiwanese TED Talk. It was in Chinese. I don't speak Chinese, I'm sorry, but he's really like, he speaks like 9 languages fluently at least, and he speaks quite a few more, at least to some degree. And he was like convincing me that I needed to help, out this Polyglot Club. Not that I knew what that word even meant. we helped found that, which was really useful too. And like, we got a lot of different languages going on, but I wasn't good at anything yet at that point beyond Japanese.
Right.
But anyway, I guess the main point is like, in terms of the way that I learned Japanese, I really, from the start, was listening to a lot of the language and also trying to connect it with English in my head, but at the same time hearing the way that it was naturally spoken, so I could have that mental connection with my native language without it actually affecting the kind of the sentence structure and like kind of the natural flow of the Japanese, because I was hearing it in like such a natural way all the time. From just, or even the early days of watching Japanese media, once, also being on exchange and just like having a very long kind of like natural connection with the language as a result, in addition to like a lot of, like I said, great teachers and, a lot of personal study as well, lots and lots of like,
Sure.
lots and lots of vocabulary study and stuff. So, and I think that, this is a great way to learn a language that is so different from your native language. I think that you need to have this kind of even, like sort of passive listening and kind of getting used to how the language actually sounds and how words are actually used. And that's why I think that's one of the issues with right now in Japan with English education is when kids go see movies, like American movies, which they don't even do that often unless it's like the new Disney movie or something. They all see it dubbed.
Oh yeah.
Into the Japanese,
Right.
and as a result, there's so much Japanese media, which for me was a blessing when I was learning Japanese. But because there's so much Japanese media, I don't think Japanese people really have the need to be exposed to English media because
Oh
they
yeah.
already have media, and I think that actually is a huge detriment to their ability to
Oh yeah.
kind of naturally pick up English.
It's the same for the rest of the world. Also, many countries in Europe only have dubbed version of everything, and when I was growing up in Denmark, we didn't have dubbed version of anything except for cartoons, and whatever cartoons. You're so young anyway, but I keep being asked like, why do you have such amazing English ability in the
Uh,
northern countries? And I honestly I go to the dubbed every time because I watched, when I was a kid, I used to watch Knight Rider. I used to watch
nice.
Baywatch, of course. Friends was very popular, and it was just all in
Speak from it.
English. So that was subtitles, but it was all in English. So I got a lot of input, and that's what I think did the trick. Also, games, of course, were never dubbed.
Yeah,
So when I played games, we always had to learn the language, or otherwise we didn't understand what the game was about. But
yeah,
when I see countries that have very weak English skills, they usually dub everything as well. So, like you say, they just don't get any. They don't get any English. Even if you have great English skills, they will have a very bookish, thick accent
yeah.
because they never hear the language. So that's kind of sad. But I hope that I hope that they're gonna see the value of not dubbing everything soon. But I
Mm,
don't know. It's a tough one because it's such a cultural
yeah.
part of the whole thing. Also, if you start not dubbing, you're sort of saying, well, their culture is more important than ours in a way.
Yeah,
Like if
yeah.
you
Well,
suddenly
yeah. People
so
want to enjoy the movies too, right? And I guess that for a lot of people, I mean, because I was watching some of those movies from a fairly young age, I don't really feel this way myself, but I think that for a lot of people, they just want to sit down and enjoy like a really cool
right.
movie, and they don't want to have to read, text on the bottom of a screen. They just want to be able to just kind of interact with this cool movie without having to go through the effort of reading the subtitles and stuff. Which, if you're just after entertainment, it makes sense that
It
that'd be
does,
the
yeah.
case. But it really is just so hugely detrimental. And this is something that I also, especially in the past, like probably 2 years or so, I've been really thinking about more and more about how much like that sort of media. I mean, I think it's really interesting that that as you say, like so many things get dubbed in much of Europe and other countries, because especially in countries that don't produce enough media themselves to really fulfill what the audience needs. That obviously so much ends up getting imported from America, but that if they weren't dubbing it, that would be such like an incredible gold mine for the English education systems. It's really it's a mix of the fact that, man, I wish that wasn't the case,
Hmm.
because it would really increase everyone's ability to speak and probably get them more involved in language learning as well, I think. But on the other hand, like people want to make money and also people want to just enjoy their movies. So like I can't get too angry, even though as a language learner, like
Yeah.
I think that dubbing is as a concept to me it's ridiculous,
Yeah.
but to other people that's how they enjoy movies. So I can't really fault them for that too much, I guess.
Yeah, it's such a cultural difference that it's also hard to understand because when obviously I never saw anything dubbed, and then suddenly I saw how it looked when they gave like Arnold Schwarzenegger a German voice, and I was like, how can you watch this? I
uh
mean, but then they told me some German people were like, yeah, but the thing is, it's the same guy doing Arnold's voice in every Arnold movie.
yeah,
So
right,
the,
yeah,
so
that's a
the
thing.
so the dubbing institute has like 20 guys or whatever and 20 girls, and so they associate that voice with Arnold in every one of Arnold's movies. So it's very elaborate, and they're actually also really good at dubbing. Like
Yeah,
they really match the space with the translation really well. Whereas I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
the Russian way of dubbing is completely ridiculous. And
With the lectern or whatever it's
I
called, right? Where they
cannot
just speak
understand.
over.
Yeah, it's like I can hear both. Can you make it stop, please? And at first
Yeah,
I thought it was
it's a really strange thing.
how do you? I mean, Russian people must be super intelligent in a way to be able to hear two things at once, or be able to
Maybe
shut down. They able to shut off one audio source, or are they? Do they listen to both?
are you mentally? I always wonder if people are used to watching it that way. Are you mentally associating the voice under the original voice that you're kind of hearing? Are you associating that that's like the voice of the character
Yeah,
while like transmitting what the lectern or whatever is saying into that voice, or how does it work? I'm not
I
sure.
I couldn't watch it for 5 seconds. I downloaded a Friends episode and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna watch Friends in Russian. That's good practice.
Yeah,
Get more input. And I was like 2 minutes in, I'm like, I can't watch this.
it doesn't work unless
It's
you're used to it.
it's
I
too
think.
messy. I just don't get it. It's
Unfortunately, that would be such a gold. That would be like such a great source
yeah.
of like because the only reason I like it's funny that I said that for me dubbing is ridiculous and I don't like it, but the fact is that now that I study all these other languages, dubbed version of films really are one of those
Oh yeah,
really
yeah,
good ways I actually get to hear that language, especially Disney movies because on it it's actually still pretty fun to watch it. Like an animated movie can still be pretty fun.
yeah.
And
No, Disney movies are clever, especially the newer ones, because they have, they have a basic story that a child can understand and appreciate, but they have all these jokes and underlying layers that you really need to be very old, or well, not very old, but you definitely need to be an adult to understand a
some
lot
sort
of
of
jokes.
maturity.
Yeah, exactly. Like for instance, Frozen is a great movie that I really like, but it's if you look at the demographics, it's mostly enjoyed by girls in the age of 4 to 8
Yeah.
or something. So it's not exactly the most interesting to be associated with, but it's just the humor is so clever that there are a lot of jokes in it that I understand that the girls would never even begin to understand in as a 5-year-old or whatever. So I totally agree with you. I think animated movies are great. Also the Pixar movies
Oh yeah.
are really
Well, all this sort
fantastic.
of any entertainment that's made for it really is like sometimes kids entertainment is called family entertainment when a lot of stuff that's made for kids is really clearly aimed just at kids.
Yeah.
But mostly Disney movies, Pixar movies, stuff like this. It really is family. I would also say the Ghibli movies. I don't know if you know Hayao Miyazaki or whatever, like Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away. It's like these really famous Japanese animated movies that are really quite incredible. But like these movies that are really made for families and that they're really made that everyone at any age can really enjoy and associate with aspects of it. It's not dumbed down to too great of an extent in any way. And so these are like great movies to watch for learning language because it's really they're entertaining movies. You enjoy the movies. You want to watch the movies. And also the language isn't going to be so complex as to really limit your ability, especially if you're like a recent learner of a language to understand anything. But it's also aimed at enough of a general audience that there's interesting things being said, and it's worth listening to. It's not incredibly simple, and there will be some very interesting things once you start to figure them out. It's really worthwhile to watch these movies, listen to these movies in other languages, and more so than like some more like adult-oriented sort of movies or like very, very kiddie-oriented movies.
Yeah, for sure. I think the best would probably be if you could get some good dubs of the Friends of the world. I don't know what kind of shows would be like that, but that's a very social and very, I guess, casual kind of speech where they're just friends hanging out, and that kind of the lines they speak are some you would find yourself. Whereas if you watch Game of Thrones or something, I mean, I guess half of the stuff you'd never ever use in real life. And
I read some of Game of Thrones. I actually have my copy of Game of Thrones in Japanese sitting right next to me, but it's just so ridiculous reading a book like that in a foreign language because already so much of it is like very jargony, like words that really only have a place within that universe. So you try to there's not as much of a point of reading it in another language necessarily because so much of it is just going to be these words that that really don't have any place in the language that you're trying to read it
Right.
in,
It's
So
self-contained, and it can be quite frustrating sometimes. I read Harry Potter books originally in English, and then for some reason I got hold of the Danish copy at some point, and I was just like, "Wow, they changed all the names, and
yeah.
this is really weird." Like they made the names in English are quite kind of clever and they make
Mm.
sense, and in Danish they just became sort of almost a mockery of these names, and
Yeah,
I was like,
in
I don't
English, it's like kind of
find
like
it
there's like
legitimate.
a subtle joke in so many of the names, but it's very
Yeah.
subtle. It's fun, it's subtle, but in the translations, if you're attempting to mimic that style, or even maybe worse, directly translate that style, it just doesn't work, right?
No, it doesn't. And so for me, that completely ruined it. And I just prefer the originals now. And I guess that's also a point of the language learning is media is supposed to be enjoyed in the original language, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't say I can't say if there are better dubs out there sometimes than the original, but I think at least for English entertainment, I think that you'll
Yeah.
get the most out of the original. And maybe one day the Russians will dub as like the rest of the world, and maybe I can watch
I
something.
was on an Aeroflot flight like a year ago, coming back from, it was Israel, Jordan, and Russia, and I think it was the flight back from Russia, and I did find Game of Thrones dubbed into Russian, and it was actually dubbed.
Wow, nice.
Like,
Okay.
yeah, it was actually dubbed, and I got to hear like Tyrion Lannister with like this incredibly deep Russian voice, and
Nice.
that was a lot of fun. So like, I guess it does exist out there, and I recently found a copy of like the old I'm trying to remember, maybe it was DreamWorks movie Anastasia, like the animated movie Anastasia. I found that dubbed into Russian. It was like actually dubbed as well, since it's a
Ah,
kids
nice.
movie, so like they actually do it properly, and that's in Russia, so it's pretty fitting as well.
Oh yeah.
Find things like that is incredibly useful.
Yeah, Anastasia is one of those 20 names you can name your child these days in Russia, so you'll find lots of Anastasias around.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, but I love, like I said, I love the Frozen movie. I watched that a lot in different languages, and the
Yeah,
Russian
yeah.
ones for
I
sure.
know that movie better in Hebrew. I know every single songs in Hebrew. And then secondly, I know them in Japanese because the entire country is obsessed with what they call what is it, like Ana to, yeah, Yuki no Jo is what they call it, right? Like Anna and the Snow Queen is
Oh,
the
really
Japanese.
nice.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
I
funny.
guess it's pretty
Also,
okay.
that's really
Um,
funny that every title is kind of like an interpretation of
yeah.
the original. Whereas Frozen is really ambiguous; it can mean anything. But in Russian, they call it the Frozen Heart, which is
Oh,
a very
really?
that's an
Like
interpretation.
that's kind of like that's evocative. I like that.
Yeah, and what's it called? I think I don't remember what the Danish is. They might just have called it Frozen because we're
Yeah,
such an
yeah.
anglicized country that it doesn't matter. You can just call it anything. But I've seen some of
I
the
think
other titles, and they're very different.
I think Hebrew is lishboreta kerach, which I think means breaking the ice, which is kind of like, it's like a
Wow.
double sort of joke, right? But my personal favorite is not Frozen. Now, Japan is famous for either just taking names of foreign movies and making them into like just a Japan, like kind of like a Japanese pronounced version, like the in that case, Frozen would have been called like Furozen or something,
Right.
and yeah, but they either do that or they completely change the title. And my favorite example was you probably know the Pixar movie Up, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so Up in Japanese, I think it's called Karuji-san no Sora Tobu Ie, which means Old Man Carl's house that flies in the sky.
That is very descriptive, yeah.
Yeah, it's very, it's like I don't think I need to watch the movie anymore. I think you just told me the entire movie, so I probably, I think I just watched the movie by reading that title.
Oh yeah, I see that the Danish title was actually Frost.
Okay, all right, so it's close.
Yeah, that's pretty close. The German is the Ice Queen completely unfrozen. I think unverfroren. That sounds like unfrozen to me, but my German is a little bit sketchy. So
That title sounds kind of questionable.
yeah, and the French is the Queen of the Snow.
Okay, there's like that theme because it's kind of based off of the Snow Queen or
Right,
whatever.
exactly. And I
And
see
the
all the Spanish countries have a frozen adventure. A frozen adventure, I think it's called. Una aventura congelada. That sounds like a frozen adventure.
Okay,
Or
okay.
the entire Spanish-speaking part of the podcast is making fun of me now, but that's okay. Uh,
I'm sure all the Israeli listeners are making fun of my accent as well, so don't worry about it.
That's great. So the last thing I really want to talk to you about is you've had this very rich in input approach to learning Japanese, and I
Mm.
just wanted to know how you're making that for your other languages, because obviously we often talk about the importance of input, but I often find it hard to do this kind of input because it can seem a little bit tedious when you don't understand anything. It might be hard to create that inversion environment in your hometown, like if you're in, I don't know, Tulsa, Oklahoma or something, and you want to study,
Mhm.
I don't know, French. It might be hard to create that immersion that gave you the success of Japanese. So how are you making your experience of Japanese work for you in the new language you're learning?
Well, you bring up a really good point there, which is that it's like I said before, Japan has this huge media which produces such a huge amount of content that even though a lot of it is like not great, there are a lot of things that are really good.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very easy to be engaged with Japanese media as long as you're not completely adverse to like, animation or something like that. Because there's, even if you're not a big fan of that sort of stuff, there's at least going to be a few things, a few shows that are so good they have these real crossover appeal. And there's so much of that sort of stuff that I think it's very easy to find a lot of content that is really worth watching. And I think that for a lot of languages, especially like one of my languages, and it's in fact one of the languages I focused the most on in the past year was Mongolian. And like Mongolian has such an incredible dearth of media content that you can easily access as an English speaker at least. That I really had an incredibly hard time listening to enough to be able to really communicate properly once I was there. Like I was able to once I studied, I did like a 3-4 month long like language mission with Mongolian before I went to Mongolia last winter break. And I learned a lot. Like I think it's probably like it's probably like my third or fourth best foreign language,
Wow.
at least when I speak it, and at least in terms of what I know of it. Like I learned like 1,000 words, and I learned like all the cases, and I actually managed to do like more than I've done with a lot of other languages. As pathetic as that might seem, but once I got there, I really I could say what I wanted to say, and I could say a lot of things. But my ability to like have like a real back and forth was limited because I just had such a hard time understanding what people were saying because it was very difficult to find content. But what I was able to find, and after, especially coming back from Mongolia, is really using YouTube to find music at the very least, which I think is probably the easiest way that people can engage with like listening to the language's music, and especially with YouTube. If you can figure out how to search in the language that in like your target language, even just like a simple set phrase like lyrics of song this, or like just figure out like or just like put in like Mongolian songs in Mongolian into YouTube, and so much will pop up, pop music or whatever.
Right.
Listening to that is really helpful, and starting to recognize the ways things are said even for music is just so incredibly useful, and trying to find some sort of like I don't think there's only like 3 major Mongolian language movies that have ever come out of Mongolia into like like they have their own, they do have their own movies, but like nothing that has ever been made available to people who aren't in Mongolia except for like two documentary type, like kind of semi-documentary, not really documentary,
Right.
drama movies. I think one's The Tale of the Weeping Camel, the other one is Cave of the Yellow Dog, and then there's the Russian-made movie Mongol about Genghis Khan.
Okay.
And those are like the only 3 Mongolian language movies that you can easily get access to. And the Mongol movie, it's a Russian-made movie, and almost every single actor in that movie is, well, the guy who plays Genghis Khan is, I think it's Asano Tadanobu, who's like a really famous Japanese actor.
Okay.
Yeah, right? And like every other actor is like Chinese, and it's all in Mongolian. but it's all just phonetically memorized Mongolian, right? So
Yeah.
it's like completely, like the delivery is not exactly good or helpful if you're trying to learn it. So Mongolian is like the most extreme example, but I still managed to I managed to search, and I managed to finally find content on YouTube, and I've been listening to that. For other things, I just really I try to find and sometimes just force myself to kind of watch movies from the different languages. I look into what people actually have enjoyed and recommend. With Hebrew, something that's been incredibly helpful is I use an online radio app, and I just listen to. There's an Israeli station called Galgalatz, which is like the most popular station in Israel, has a really big cultural impact apparently as well, and they play an amazing mix of both like kind of Western English and sometimes French and Spanish music, and also and also like the other 50% is Hebrew, and they also play like music from like every single like decade as well, so you'll never really know what you're going to hear when you turn it on, but it's always going to be like either like the most recent cool stuff from Israel or from around the world, or it's going to be something from the 60s from England, or some like Eurovision song from the 70s. You never know what you're going to get, but it constantly, that sort of station, it constantly both gives you a lot of cool stuff that you know from your own culture maybe to listen to, especially if you come from an English speaking culture, and then also lots and lots of really great Hebrew stuff as well, and that has really kept my Hebrew going, even though I haven't been actively studying it for a long time, since I've been studying other languages. So I try to combine all these things to keep that input happening. And like you said, like maybe if you're in Tulsa or something, it's difficult to find like someone speaking French. But believe me, I live in Fukushima Prefecture in the Tohoku North region of Japan, and where even like Japan, only like 2.5% of the population or something is not are non-Japanese citizens. But most of those people are in either the big cities or they're in the big manufacturing areas, depending on what sort of work they do or whatever. So otherwise, Japan is like really one of the most homogeneous, like, monolingual countries there is in a lot of ways. And so like, and I'm studying like Mongolian and Russian and, and French and, Hebrew. I mean, like these are not languages I have any opportunity to use at all. Like Arabic as well, right? Like these are not languages, maybe if I learned Portuguese, because there's actually a lot of Brazilians who came here in that's an entirely different story. But like even in the area where I live, there aren't like, I think there's maybe a few, like 3 of them, if I hunted them down or something, which I'd have to like literally hunt them down to even find them,
Right.
So,
but still, you're trying to create that immersion feeling by listening or watching. I think the only problem I have with that, and I definitely try to do the same, the only problem is when I'm early in my studies, I remember trying to do it for Russian, I would get really disinterested really quickly.
Right, yeah, that happens. Well, I try to use, honestly, well, it depends on how far I feel I am along with the language, but like, I think there is a lot of value in using subtitles. I think a lot of other people who learn languages might disagree with me on that. But
it can definitely help you keep the focus, and it's the amount of input that matters. It's not so much, I guess, how deeply you study each individual word. I mean, you just need to hear it a lot of times.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I think it probably worked a little bit better when I was younger and had more of that kind of brain elasticity or whatever, that I was able to just hear it while reading it and just get so much of it back then. But I still can do it, maybe not to the exact same extent, but as long as you're actively trying to mentally, like, I know some people read subtitles and they stop listening to the language being spoken. Like, it's just in the background, it's a sound they associate with the character, but they aren't listening to the words. And you do kind of have to mentally do this. You need to actually make the effort to both be actively listening while actively reading and trying to figure out these connections. I'm sure some people also say that often subtitles are they're not accurate as well, which is quite often true, but once you start to make these connections of patterns, maybe this subtitle didn't say the exact same thing as this subtitle when this phrase was said, but you start to recognize that the general meaning of that phrase, which honestly I think in some cases can be more useful than a direct translation, even if they're different translations, or even like some sort of strange translation where like the translator was really taking some liberties to try to make it more like natural English or whatever. Once you start to realize the general feeling of what that phrase meant, that can give you almost more of a natural understanding, I think, than directly translating can really do. This is something that has been really helpful to me in every language that I've studied, as long as I've actually actively tried to like watch the media and use subtitles at the same time.
Oh, that's actually a very, very interesting idea, because when you create subtitles, obviously often you're very constrained in terms of how much space you have.
Absolutely.
So when you do a subtitle, it's often not a very natural way of saying things, or
It's like truncated, you know?
yeah, or you use a different vocabulary because it's just if you have less space. But you're right in the sense that if you explore different ways of saying the same thing, you suddenly, instead of translating word for word, you're suddenly translating meaning into meaning.
Yeah.
Which can be quite powerful. What's your experience with using foreign subtitles? Are you watching a Russian movie with Russian subtitles, for instance?
I think that's also incredibly useful. That's what I've done with a lot of Hebrew movies, and I've managed to do it with some other languages as well. I do that with, honestly, that when I watch a Japanese movie nowadays, usually I really don't need subtitles either way at this point. For the most part, I guess it depends on the topic, but even if I'm understanding 95% of what's being said on the screen, if I throw on those subtitles and I actively read the subtitles while it's being spoken, I will catch new words and phrases that I completely missed. You know, when you're understanding 90% of something, the parts that you don't understand, you kind of sometimes mentally just ignore them, because you got enough of the context that you understood what was being said, even if you didn't actually understand this word or this word. When you're reading subtitles, it makes you really recognize those parts that you're missing. And I find that incredibly useful to, just kind of pick up those words that I missed and then really figure those out. And nowadays, when I'm at the advanced state of the language that I'm at with Japanese, that's really one of the best ways that I have to continue learning, is to just engage in like that sort of fun media, but also take whatever there is there that I don't know and try to make sure that I know it for the next time. And I also found that very useful when I was like first getting back into Hebrew. I think my copy of Frozen just had the Hebrew subtitles somehow. That was like, we're coming back to Frozen. Obviously,
Yeah.
Frozen is the godsend for all language learners
I
in the
do
world.
love Frozen, yeah. I do listen to the songs quite often as well. Bit of guilty pleasure there.
Thank the Lord for Frozen. Thank the Lord.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it was really helpful to have that. So I think that both methods are great ways. But if you're a beginner, especially, I think that maybe starting off with your native language subtitles can be more enjoyable and more useful in the beginning. But obviously, the mixing of the two is always a great way to do things.
Right, because you might lose the interest early on if you don't understand anything. Even though it's useful input, it might help you more to have something to hook your attention to, that you can actually understand what's going on.
Yeah, the enjoyment's no matter whether you're teaching or you're learning. I think that keeping that constant enjoyment is what's important, especially in the beginning, before, the success and that feeling, that invigorating feeling of, oh, I understand this, I'm getting this. Before that kicks in, as you get better at a language, you just need that kind of enjoyment that comes from maybe a little bit outside of the fact that you can't necessarily understand that much. So.
Yeah, definitely. It's all about making it fun so we can keep doing it. But
Absolutely.
before we wrap up, I know I said this probably once before, but I just had another thing I wanted to ask you, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of quick Cliff Note tips for anyone learning Japanese? Because obviously you've been learning for a long time, and I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who are learning it, because it's quite a popular language actually in the community, I've noticed, and I can understand why. I mean, I love the way it sounds. Obviously, I don't have any time to actually put any work into it, or I don't have any reason to learn it either, so it's kind of
That's kind of interesting.
But that doesn't stop some people, though. Let me just tell you. But I just wanted to, if you had any sort of quick tips for Japanese learners here on the final few minutes.
I would just reiterate firstly what I've already, kind of gone on to about in length, is that Japanese is one of the languages where, as I said before, the media is so huge, so it's so easy to get involved and find films and find movies, if for you reading is something that you like more than listening when you're learning a language as well, Japan is like basically the biggest comics culture in the entire world, I would say. Just an insane amount. Japanese, I would also add, is something that I didn't really touch on at all, is that obviously the writing system is very intimidating because there's 3 separate alphabets, 2 of which are phonetic. One is only for, foreign loan words, and then the third is the Chinese characters, which are called kanji in Japanese. And I think that basically, if you wanna like feel like you're a fluent reader of Japanese, you need to learn 3,000 of these.
Okay.
And it's more difficult than Chinese because, at least in terms of reading, or at least I am told, since I don't study Chinese enough to really say myself. But I know that in Chinese, most characters, they usually only have one sound that they make. But because Japanese took them from China and from Chinese, they have both the sound that Japanese people thought that the Chinese sound made, but also a Japanese sound, and they can have multiple different sounds that are not connected in any way, and depending on the context and what character it's linked up with, it can change. So, there's just so many levels of complexity to the written form, and writing as well can be pretty crazy. But I would just say to people, as you're learning this, don't get too intimidated about this. It's really something you get as it goes on. It's one reason I think Japanese takes much longer to be really truly functional in all forms, both speaking, writing, reading, than maybe other languages do, is because of the sheer ridiculousness of this writing system. I don't know if I mean ridiculous in a bad way, because it's a beautiful aspect of the culture, but it is insane, because kids are still learning how to write their own alphabet well into middle school and even high school.
Right.
But it's really a really cool aspect once you start to get into it and figure it out. It becomes kind of like knowing Greek and Latin roots for English. It gives you so much more meaning. When you learn a word, you're like, oh, I get why this word is this word, because these 2 characters, which have their own separate meanings, they come together to make this. It's really cool. And if you're reading things for younger people, or even comics for teenagers, they have these little furigana, phonetic stuff on top of the kanji. You can just read that. And so you don't need to throw yourself directly into these texts that are literally impossible to read if you're anywhere near a beginner. So don't be intimidated by that. It can be, once you start getting it, can be really enjoyable, even though it'll still be a long slog to really be able to be fully, functioning with kanji.
Right.
So yeah, I think that engaging in the culture, really listening to the language, engaging with the media is, and really starting to understand how some degree of how the thought process of the people here work really helps with the language as well, because the language is so ingrained with the culture itself. And don't be too intimidated by the characters. If you try, you'll get it. You'll get it. I believe in you.
Right. I like the idea of characters, honestly. That would be one of my reasons for learning Chinese or Japanese, or
it's fascinating.
Another character-based system, because it's just such a radically different way of approaching written form. And for me, it would be a lot of fun to just memorize the different characters and be able to make out the connections, because often at least for Chinese, as I've experienced, it's a very logical connection, the way the characters are put together to form compounds and meaning. So if you, like you say, if you understand some characters by themselves, then you can also usually interpret what they mean together. And
yeah, even though in Japanese you might have no idea how that word is said, you can kind of figure out what it is.
Right.
If you like learning languages and you like beyond, if for you just learning quickly is your goal, then it can be frustrating. But if the process of learning and understanding and tackling something complex is appealing, I think Japanese is a great language to learn, because they can be very invigorating to learn kanji and add to that understanding. It's a very long process, but it really is an incredible skill once you get it, and
right.
It's really cool to learn. And I guess my one and only additional thing that I forgot to mention, I guess, is that Japan, Japan does have a really there's a lot of really great opportunities to come to Japan as both a tourist and to work here, especially if you're a native English speaker or a high-level English speaker. So if people want to learn Japanese, I really recommend. For me, I know that immersion was incredibly helpful in all the forms that I had it. And if people want to come here for, a year, and especially if teaching is something that appeals to you and you feel that there's value and that's something you'd like to do, I think there's a lot of opportunities for that, probably more so than in almost any other country in the world in some ways.
Right.
And so that's also a great thing to be able to do. If that's interesting to people, then they should definitely look into coming here in some form.
Oh, that's cool. I mean, if people are sitting back in Tulsa and watching the animes, and I don't know why I mentioned Tulsa. I just thought of a random city.
I'm sure all your Tulsa fans are appreciating.
Oh yeah, the Tulsa fans are like, "Whoa, he mentioned our city." But if they are sitting there, it's good to have some kind of strategy to how to make it into real life, because sometimes you're thinking, how can I afford going to Japan or China if I'm learning these languages? But the English learning market is something to look into. I mean, you can, if you're a native English speaker, you're almost guaranteed a job. And I mean, these aren't exactly, amazingly well paid usually, or amazing working conditions, but the experience, and if you want to just go and experience the country for a year or two, I'm sure it's more than a good conditions. I mean, it's good enough, right? It's not.
I mean, everything is what you make of it, I think, especially when it comes to living abroad and if you're trying to learn the language. But you put into it, you'll get back. I mean, this is like, if we got into like the conditions of English teaching here, or like how that can affect, this sort of job, how that can affect your language learning stuff, that's another topic that we could go on for like another hour.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I'll recommend people instead check out the other podcast episodes where we talk about studying, or not studying abroad, teaching abroad. But in general, I just wanted to mention it, and it's good that you brought it up as well, that you should have that as an open mind. You should keep it in mind anyway, because some people just assume it's not possible and then don't think about it. But actually, it is a possibility, and it's not just Japan. Japan. It's not just Japan. It's also a big part of the world actually have English programs that are sort of built for. I guess you can almost call them like au pair teachers in a way, because they're there for a very limited amount of time. Usually these programs are kind of like exchange programs, and there's a big they replace them quickly. They just go for a year or something. But of course, if you find your true calling, that's also a possibility. Like you can stay in the country and live there forever.
It's true. There's a lot of people who come here and they think they're coming for 1 year, and 18 years later.
Yeah, there you go. Time flies. And speaking of time flies, thank you so much for coming on the show, and I really appreciate you reaching out and being willing to share your story. It's really motivating and inspirational to me, and hopefully also the listeners.
Yeah, it's no problem. I was really happy to be able to talk with you, and I've really enjoyed your show for a while now. So I think you're doing the Polyglot community a great service, and I'm happy that I was able to, be a little tiny part of that somehow.
Thank you so much. You're very modest. You did a great job.
Oh, thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you so much for listening to the Actual Fluency podcast. If you want to come onto the podcast and share your language learning story, don't hesitate to apply on actualfluency.com/guest. See you in the next one.